Elsie Grant was 29 years old, 6 months pregnant, and standing in the snow outside the Harker farmhouse when the door locked behind her. Her suitcase sat at her feet with one broken latch, 2 cotton dresses, a wool coat, and a small tin recipe box wrapped in a faded dish towel. Behind the glass, the house glowed warm and yellow. She could see the polished table where she had served supper, and the staircase Thomas Harker had once promised she would climb as his wife. But Thomas was not beside her now. He stood inside, behind his mother's shoulder, looking at the floor. By the end of the week, the whole town would know that Elsie had been sent away before her baby was born. By the next county auction, those same people would laugh when she spent nearly every dollar she had left on a ruined Wisconsin creamery no one had wanted in 20 years. The roof sagged. The windows were boarded. The milkroom smelled of rust, old wood, and frozen stone. One man said the place was not worth the snow piled against its door. But what nobody knew was that beneath that dead creamery, under boards sealed tight long before Elsie was born, something had been waiting in the cold. And before her child ever opened its eyes, that forgotten place would give Elsie a name no one could take from her. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories about people the world underestimated mean something to you, hit the like button and subscribe, because this one begins with a woman everyone thought had already lost. Elsie had learned young that a woman could lose a home without leaving it. She was 8 when her father died on a gray November morning. His boots stayed by the kitchen door because her mother could not bear to move them. Their rented house outside Chilton grew quieter after that. Bills came in folded envelopes. Neighbors came with casseroles, stayed for an hour, then returned to their own warm kitchens. Anna Grant did not have land, jewelry, or savings. What she had was a dented tin recipe box with a blue flower painted on the lid. At night, after washing dishes in cold water, she would sit at the table and write on index cards softened by steam. Use less flour when the air is damp. Save the way for soup. Never waste cream. Feed people before you ask what they can pay. Elsie watched her mother turn scraps into meals and silence into endurance. There was no magic in it, only careful hands, low fire, clean jars, and the stubborn belief that something small could still be enough. By 12, Elsie could measure flour by touch. By 14, she could stretch soup for 3 extra people. By 16, she knew how to scrub a kitchen until it smelled like soap instead of worry. Her mother taught her one rule more important than all the rest. Write things down, Anna said. A woman who keeps records is harder to erase. After Anna died, the tin box became Elsie's only inheritance. She carried it from one rented room to another, wrapped in the same dish towel. When she was afraid, she opened the lid and read the notes in the margins. Keep the fire low. Trust the smell before the clock. Do not throw away what can still feed someone. That last line followed her everywhere. When Elsie came to Harker Dairy Farm at 24, she was hired for the work no one praised. She cleaned the kitchen. She washed milk pails. She wiped down counters in the bottling room until her knuckles cracked in winter. Mrs. Harker told her she would help wherever simple hands were needed. Elsie nodded because she needed the job. But simple hands notice complicated things. She noticed when milk came in too warm from the west barn. She noticed which delivery slips were copied twice and which customers complained after a late shipment. She noticed the cream separator made a thin whining sound before the belt slipped. She wrote numbers neatly, dated every page, and balanced the small ledgers better than the men who were supposed to teach her. Thomas Harker noticed that first. He brought coffee to the back step before morning chores. He carried heavy crates without making a show of it. He asked once how she could remember so many figures. "My mother taught me to write things down," Elsie said. By spring, he was walking with her beside the pasture fence. By summer, he was waiting after evening chores. By autumn, he had slipped a silver ring onto her finger beneath the maple tree near the wash house. For a little while, Elsie believed work, patience, and love had finally opened a door. Then Mrs. Harker saw the ring. She did not shout. She only looked at Elsie's apron, then at the mud on Elsie's shoes, then at the small silver band. "That belonged to Thomas's grandmother," she said. Elsie held her hand close to her side. He gave it to me. Yes, Mrs. Harker said. I imagine he did. After that, the farmhouse changed by inches. Elsie's place at supper moved farther from Thomas. Conversations stopped when she entered the pantry. Mr. Harker checked the ledgers after she finished them. Mrs. Harker began calling her the girl again, even when Elsie stood close enough to hear. Thomas told her not to worry. They'll come around, he said, but he said it while looking toward the barn, not into her face. When Elsie learned she was carrying his child, the first snow had just begun to gather along the fence posts. She told Thomas in the washroom, where steam fogged the windows and soap water ran along the floor drain. For 1 second, his face softened with wonder. Then, fear closed over it. That night, Elsie lay awake in the attic room, one hand resting over the life beneath her ribs. Below her, voices moved through the walls. Reputation. Mistake. Property. Not our kind. The silver ring felt cold on her finger. By morning, her suitcase was outside the mudroom door. Thomas stood beside it, pale and silent, while Mrs. Harker held the farmhouse key in her fist. Elsie looked past them at the kitchen she had cleaned, the table she had set, and the warm windows that had fooled her into believing she belonged. Then she bent down, picked up her mother's tin recipe box, and stepped into the snow. Elsie did not walk far that first morning. The snow was too deep along the lane, and her body was too tired to pretend it was brave. She made it as far as the old mailbox at the end of the Harker Drive, where the county road curved past a line of bare maple trees. There, she stopped with one hand on the post and looked back. The farmhouse stood bright against the white field. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight gray ribbon. The barn doors were shut against the wind. A hired hand crossed the yard carrying 2 pails, his head lowered as if he had not seen her standing there. But Elsie knew he had. Everyone saw what they were told not to notice. That was how Harker Dairy Farm had survived so long. It was not the biggest farm in Wisconsin, but it was the kind of place people pointed to when they wanted to talk about order, hard work, family pride, and clean money. The Harkers owned 3 barns, 2 silos, a long white farmhouse, and half the delivery routes that carried milk and butter through the county. Their name was printed on glass bottles, feed invoices, church donation plaques, and the side of the truck that rolled through town every morning before sunrise. To most people, that name meant quality. To Elsie, for 5 years, it had meant shelter. She had arrived there with a canvas bag, her mother's recipe box, and a pair of shoes already splitting at the heel. Mrs. Harker had looked her over in the kitchen doorway and decided she was thin enough to work hard and quiet enough not to cause trouble. At first, Elsie had been grateful for even that. The farm gave her a room under the eaves, 3 meals when work ran late, and wages she folded carefully into envelopes marked rent, winter coat, doctor, and someday. She learned the schedule of the place like a second heartbeat. Before dawn, the milkers moved through the barn. At 6, the kitchen stove was hot. At 7, the first delivery truck coughed awake in the yard. By noon, invoices were stacked near the office door, and by evening, the floors smelled of soap, hay, and tired animals. Elsie kept track of what others forgot. She knew which calf had trouble nursing, which churn needed a new belt, which customer always returned bottles clean, and which one sent them back with mud around the necks. She knew that Mr. Harker rounded numbers in his favor when small farmers sold cream to him by weight. She knew Mrs. Harker kept a separate notebook in the locked pantry drawer, one she closed whenever Elsie entered the room. Elsie did not ask questions. A woman without family learned the danger of asking questions in a house where she could be dismissed before supper. Instead, she worked. She worked until the Harker kitchen shone. She worked until the men stopped correcting her figures because her figures were usually right. She worked until Thomas began watching her from the office doorway with an expression she mistook for respect. Maybe it had been respect at first. Elsie still wanted to believe that. Thomas was the youngest son, the one people called gentle because he spoke softly and never slammed doors. He had light hair, careful hands, and the sad gift of making weakness look like kindness. When he sat beside Elsie on the back steps after evening chores, he spoke of leaving the farm one day, of making cheese instead of only selling milk, of building something smaller and honest. "There used to be creameries all over this county," he told her once, tossing a pebble into the dirt. "Real ones, family ones, before everything got bought up." Elsie remembered the way his voice changed when he said that. Almost ashamed, almost longing. She asked him what happened to them. Thomas shrugged. "Bad luck, bad business. Times changed." Then he looked toward the road, as if the answer had gone that way years ago. Elsie should have heard the warning in that silence. Instead, she heard a future. After he gave her the ring, she let herself imagine a small house on the edge of the farm, a cradle near a window, bread cooling on a table, her mother's recipe box on a shelf where no one could make her pack it again. She imagined Thomas standing beside her in church. She imagined Mrs. Harker softening when the first child came. Lonely women could be foolish in quiet ways. They could mistake a borrowed chair for a place at the table. When Elsie's pregnancy began to show, the kindness around her thinned like ice under a boot. Mrs. Harker stopped letting her serve customers in the front room. Mr. Harker told her to leave the ledgers on his desk instead of entering numbers herself. The hired girls avoided looking at her belly. At church, women who had once asked for her biscuit recipe suddenly found reasons to move down the pew. No one called her wicked. That would have been easier. They called her unfortunate. They called her confused. They called her a girl who had misunderstood a son's kindness. Elsie heard the words in the pauses after her name. Thomas changed too. Not all at once. First, he stopped meeting her near the pasture fence. Then he stopped touching her hand when others were in the room. Then he began saying, "After things settle," whenever she asked about the wedding. Things did not settle. They hardened. The night before she was sent away, Elsie found him in the washroom, rinsing milk cloths in water gone gray with use. She stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the doorframe. "Do you want this child?" she asked. Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and for one painful second she saw the man he might have been if courage had lived in him longer than fear. "Yes," he whispered. "Then say it downstairs." His mouth trembled. Elsie waited. From the kitchen, Mrs. Harker's voice called his name, sharp and certain. Thomas lowered his eyes. That was when something inside Elsie gave way. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply loosened, like a knot that had held too much weight for too many years. She understood then that Thomas might love her in private, might regret hurting her, might even miss her when she was gone. But he would not stand between her and the door. By morning, the house had made its decision. Mrs. Harker did not shout when she sent Elsie away. She stood in the mudroom with the farmhouse key in her hand, her dark dress buttoned to the throat, her pearl pin bright against the collar. Behind her, the kitchen stove was already hot. Coffee steamed in the blue enamel pot. Bread dough rested beneath a towel near the window, rising in the warmth Elsie had helped keep alive every morning for 5 years. On the floor sat Elsie's suitcase. It had been packed badly. One sleeve hung from the side. Her winter coat was folded wrong. The dish towel around her mother's tin recipe box had come loose, as if whoever touched it had not known it mattered, or had known and did not care. "You will be more comfortable elsewhere," Mrs. Harker said. Elsie looked at Thomas. He stood near the back stair, pale, silent, his hands hanging useless at his sides. "Did you pack this?" she asked. He opened his mouth, but his mother answered first. "Your things are all there. They are not all my things." Mrs. Harker's eyes moved to Elsie's belly. "You came here with very little." For a moment, Elsie could not speak. She looked past them at the kitchen table she had scrubbed, the pantry shelves she had stocked, the floor she had washed on her knees after long days in the milkroom. 5 years of work had left no mark they were willing to see. "My wages," she said at last. "For last month." Mr. Harker stepped into the doorway then, broad and clean-shaven, wearing the calm expression of a man who had already decided the world would agree with him. "That has been settled." He held out an envelope. Elsie did not take it right away. "How much?" "Enough. That is not a number." His jaw tightened. "You are in no position to argue over numbers." A small steadiness rose in her then. It was not courage yet. It was the old training of her mother's kitchen. Count what is owed. Read what is written. Do not sign what you do not understand. Elsie took the envelope and opened it. Inside were fewer bills than she had earned. Folded behind them was a paper written in Mr. Harker's hand. I accept this payment as full settlement and make no further claim against Harker Dairy Farm or any member of the Harker family. Elsie read the line twice. The child moved inside her, slow and heavy. You want me to sign this? It is practical, Mr. Harker said. For everyone. For Thomas too? No one answered. Elsie turned to him. Is that what you want? Thomas swallowed. His eyes were wet, but wet eyes did not open doors. Elsie, he whispered. Say yes or no. Mrs. Harker stepped forward. Do not make a scene. Elsie folded the paper and placed it back inside the envelope. I will take the wages I earned, she said. I will not sign away my child. The room went still. Mr. Harker's face changed only a little, but enough to show what lived beneath the polish. You should be careful, he said. A woman alone can make life harder than it needs to be. Elsie buttoned her coat with fingers that wanted to shake. A man with 3 barns should not be afraid of a woman with 1 suitcase. No one moved. Then Mrs. Harker opened the back door. Winter rushed in. Elsie picked up the suitcase in one hand and held the tin recipe box under her other arm, close against her coat. She did not ask Thomas to follow. She did not ask him to explain. The silence had already done that. Outside, the snow struck her face like thrown salt. The porch steps were slick. She walked carefully, because pride would not protect the baby if she fell. Halfway across the yard, Thomas called her name. Elsie stopped. For one foolish heartbeat, she thought he might come after her. She thought he might stand in the yard and say, in front of his parents and the hired hands watching from the barn, that she was not leaving alone. But he stayed on the porch. There's a room above Mrs. Bell's laundry, he said. In town. Elsie stared at him through the falling snow. That is what you have to give me? His face folded with shame. She turned before pity could soften her. The road to town was 2 miles. Elsie walked with the suitcase bumping against her leg and the recipe box pressed beneath her arm. Twice, trucks passed without slowing. Once, a neighbor woman looked through a frosted windshield and lifted one hand. Not quite a wave, not quite an apology. By the time Elsie reached town, her shoes were soaked through. Mrs. Bell did have a room above the laundry. It smelled of starch, coal smoke, and damp wool. The ceiling slanted so low near the bed that Elsie had to bend her head. There was a washstand, a cracked mirror, and one narrow window looking down into the alley. It's $3 a week, Mrs. Bell said. Cash. Elsie counted the bills from the envelope. After the room, bread, and a doctor's visit, there would be almost nothing left. Still, she paid for 1 week. That night, she sat on the bed with her wet shoes near the stovepipe. Steam lifted from the leather. The baby turned inside her as if searching for a softer place. Elsie opened the tin recipe box and took out one of her mother's cards. Do not throw away what can still feed someone. She held the card until the words blurred. The next morning, the town began shaping the story without asking her. At the laundry counter, 2 women stopped talking when she came in. At the grocer's, Mr. Alden asked if she had family coming. At church, the empty space beside her felt wider than the pew. No one said Thomas's name. They said hers often enough. On the 4th day, Mrs. Bell knocked and handed Elsie a folded notice from the county office. Tax auction next Tuesday, she said. Mostly junk. Thought you might want to see. Elsie opened the paper. There were collapsed sheds, strips of frozen land, a roofless blacksmith shop. Near the bottom, one line stopped her. Former Calumet Creamery property. Abandoned. Minimum bid. $11. Elsie read it again. Thomas had once said there used to be real creameries all over the county. Bad luck, he had told her. Bad business. Times changed. Elsie looked around the rented room, at the borrowed bed, and the suitcase she had not unpacked. Then she placed her mother's card back into the tin box and closed the lid. She had been pushed out of one door. Maybe it was time to buy another, even if everyone else believed there was nothing behind it. The county auction was held in a drafty hall behind the courthouse, where the radiator knocked like an old man clearing his throat. Elsie arrived early because she did not want to walk in after the room was full. Her coat was brushed clean. though the hem was damp from the street. Her suitcase was back at Mrs. Bell's laundry, but she carried her mother's tin recipe box in a cloth bag under one arm. She had not meant to bring it. At the last minute, she could not leave it behind. The room smelled of wet wool, floor wax, and old paper. Men stood in small groups near the front, talking about parcels, taxes, roof damage, road access, and which properties might be worth stripping for lumber. A few women sat along the wall with folded hands and careful faces. When Elsie entered, conversation lowered. Not stopped. Lowered. That was worse in some ways. It meant people wanted her to know they were speaking about her without giving her anything clear enough to answer. Mrs. Bell had told her not to mind them. People who have never been out in the cold think shame is warmer than a coat, she had said that morning. Elsie held those words as she took a seat near the back. The auctioneer was a thin man with wire glasses and a voice too cheerful for tax debt. He moved quickly through the first lots. A strip of marshland went for $5. A collapsed shed drew no bid. A blacksmith shop with no roof sold to a man who wanted the brick. Elsie kept her eyes on the paper in her lap. Former Calumet Creamery property. Abandoned. Minimum bid. $11. When the auctioneer finally called it, a soft laugh moved through the room before anyone raised a hand. Parcel 17, he said. Former Creamery building on County Road M. Structure unsound. No active utility service listed. Back taxes unpaid. Minimum bid, $11. No one moved. The auctioneer looked over his glasses. Do I hear 11? A man near the front snorted. You'd have to pay me 11 to walk inside it. Another said, roof's been sinking since Hoover. Someone else added, only thing living out there is mice. Laughter broke a little louder this time. Elsie felt heat rise into her face. She looked down at her hands and saw that one thumb was rubbing the edge of her mother's recipe box through the cloth bag. Feed people before you ask what they can pay. Do not throw away what can still feed someone. The auctioneer lifted his gavel slightly. No bid? Elsie raised her hand. The room turned. For 1 second, the only sound was the radiator knocking against the wall. The auctioneer blinked. $11? Elsie kept her hand up. Yes. A man in a brown hat turned halfway around to stare at her belly. Girl, that place won't keep you warm through one night. Elsie looked at him. Then I'll have to learn fast. A few people laughed again, but not as easily. The auctioneer waited, perhaps hoping someone else would bid and save him from selling a dead building to a pregnant woman with wet shoes. No one did. $11 once, he said. Elsie's heartbeat struck hard enough that she felt it in her throat. $11 twice. She thought of Thomas on the porch. Mrs. Harker's key. Mr. Harker's paper asking her to sign away every claim. She thought of the rented room above the laundry and the suitcase she had not unpacked. Sold, the auctioneer said, bringing the gavel down. Former Calumet Creamery property. Just like that, the room decided she was foolish. Just like that, Elsie owned a door. The deed paper was thin and official, stamped in blue ink. The clerk did not meet her eyes as he took her money. After the fee, she had less than $4 left. You understand, the county makes no guarantee of condition, he said. I understand. No guarantee of safety. I understand. No guarantee it can be occupied. Elsie folded the deed carefully and placed it inside the cloth bag with the recipe box. That part, she said, I will have to find out myself. By afternoon, clouds had lowered over the town. Elsie bought a small loaf of bread, a wedge of cheap cheese, 2 candles, and a packet of matches. Mrs. Bell gave her a wool blanket with a worn edge. Don't argue, the older woman said. It has holes. That makes it charity enough for my pride. Elsie thanked her. Then she started down County Road M. The creamery stood 4 miles beyond town, past the last clapboard houses, past a frozen pond where cattails rattled in the wind, past fields lying white and empty beneath a sky the color of tin. Elsie walked slowly. The road was rutted with old wagon tracks frozen hard under snow. Every few minutes, she shifted the bag from one arm to the other. The baby rode low and heavy, making her stop at fence posts to breathe. No one came after her. That should not have hurt by then, but it did. The farther she walked, the quieter the world became. Town sounds faded first. Wagon wheels, shop bells, men calling across the street. Then even the farm sounds thinned away. No cows lowing, no milk cans clanging, no kitchen door opening behind her. Only wind, only her own boots breaking the crust of snow. Near dusk, she saw the first sign. Calumet Creamery. The letters were faded blue on a board hanging crooked between two leaning posts. One side had broken loose, so the sign pointed down toward the ditch, as if even the name had grown too tired to stand. Beyond it, at the end of a narrow lane, sat the building. Elsie stopped. The creamery was smaller than she had imagined and worse than she had hoped. Its roof dipped in the middle. Boards covered most of the windows. A brick chimney rose from one side like a blackened finger. Weeds, stiff with ice, pressed against the foundation. Behind it, an old milk platform sagged toward the frozen yard. No smoke, no light, no sound of work, just a dead white building under a darkening Wisconsin sky. Elsie stood with the deed in her coat pocket and her mother's recipe box under her arm. For a moment, fear came so sharply she nearly turned back. Then the baby moved. Not hard, just enough. Elsie put one hand over her belly. "All right," she whispered. She stepped off the road and started down the lane toward the place everyone else had thrown away. The lane to the creamery had not been cleared in weeks. Snow covered the wagon ruts and hid the stones beneath, so Elsie had to place each step carefully. The wind came across the open fields without mercy, pushing against her coat, lifting loose strands of hair from beneath her scarf. By the time she reached the front door, her legs trembled from cold and the long walk. The building looked worse up close. One corner of the roof had sagged so low that icicles hung from it like broken teeth. The front steps were half buried. The milk platform on the side had split down the middle, and one of its beams leaned toward the frozen ground. Above the door, the old creamery sign was nearly unreadable beneath flaking paint. Elsie stood there for a moment, breathing hard. She had bought it. $11 and nearly everything she had left. She pulled the deed from her coat pocket, as if the paper might make the place feel more real. The blue stamp was still there. Her name was written in the county clerk's stiff hand. Elsie Grant, owner. The word looked too large for her life. The door was stuck at first. She pushed her shoulder against it once, then twice. On the third try, the swollen wood gave way with a groan, and a smell rolled out into the cold. Old milk, wet stone, rust, something sour that had been trapped for years. Elsie covered her mouth with her sleeve and stepped inside. The front room was dim. Boards over the windows let in thin lines of gray light. Dust lay thick on the floor, except where mice had traveled in nervous little paths along the wall. A broken chair sat upside down near the door. An old scale stood in the corner. Its metal pan tilted as if still waiting for something to be weighed. She moved slowly, listening. The building answered with creaks. In the milk room, rusted pipes ran along the wall. A cracked sink hung crooked beneath a boarded window. Two milk cans stood near the corner, their lids missing. The floor was colder there. So cold the soles of her shoes seemed to feel it through the leather. Elsie told herself not to think about night yet. First, she needed one safe corner. She found it in a small office behind the front room. The ceiling had not leaked as badly there. The floorboards were dusty but firm. An old desk leaned against the wall, and beside it stood a narrow iron stove, red with rust but still whole. The stovepipe disappeared into the wall at an angle. Elsie knelt slowly and opened the stove door. Inside were ashes, not fresh, but dry. That was enough to make her close her eyes for 1 second. A stove meant fire might be possible. Fire meant one night. She searched the office drawers. Most were empty, but in the bottom one, she found 3 bent nails, a stub of pencil, a torn feed receipt, and a box of matches so old she did not trust them. Still, she put them in her pocket. In a cupboard near the milk room, she found a stack of split wood covered by a fallen canvas tarp. The top pieces were damp. The ones beneath were dry enough. Elsie carried them 2 at a time because carrying more pulled at her back. The first match broke. The second flared, then died. The third caught on a twist of old paper from her pocket. She fed it carefully, adding slivers of wood, then thicker pieces, keeping her breath slow. Smoke curled into the room and made her eyes water. For a terrible minute, she thought the chimney was blocked. Then the draft took. The flame lifted. Small. Orange. Alive. Elsie sat back on her heels and began to cry before she could stop herself. Not loudly. There was no one there to hear. Just one hand over her mouth, the other pressed against the child inside her, while the stove ticked and warmed by inches. When the tears passed, she got up. Work was easier than fear. She dragged the broken chair into the front room, swept mouse droppings from the office with a stiff piece of board, and shook dust from Mrs. Bell's blanket outside the door. She found a crate strong enough to serve as a table. She set her candles on it, then placed her mother's tin recipe box beside them. The little blue flower on the lid looked strange in that dead room, almost brave. By full dark, the office had become the smallest kind of shelter. A fire, a blanket, a crate, a loaf of bread, half a wedge of cheese, 2 candles, a deed folded under the recipe box so it would not be lost. Elsie ate slowly, saving half the bread for morning. The cheese was dry and sharp. She chewed it carefully, thinking of the Harker dining table, where food had always been plentiful and never fully hers. Here, in a ruined creamery with a leaking roof and mice in the walls, every bite belonged to her. Outside, wind moved around the building. Inside, the stove clicked and settled. When she tried to sleep, the floor was too hard, and the cold still reached her through the blanket. Her hips ached. The child shifted. Somewhere in the walls, something scratched. More than once, Elsie opened her eyes and stared into the dark, wondering whether she had made the worst mistake of her life. Then she would turn her head and see the faint outline of the stove, still breathing heat. Near midnight, she rose to add wood. The firelight spilled through the office doorway into the milk room, touching the cracked sink, the rusted pipes, and the old scale. For the first time, Elsie noticed how the building had been arranged. This had not been a careless place once. The drains had been cut clean. The counters were placed for steady movement. Hooks lined the wall at even intervals. Whoever had worked here had known order, cleanliness, timing, and repetition. Elsie understood those things. She stood in the doorway with the fire behind her and the cold milk room ahead. The creamery was broken, but not meaningless. The thought came quietly, without comfort at first. Then it settled inside her like one more small flame. Before dawn, Elsie woke to pale light leaking through the boards over the windows. The fire had burned low but not out. Her back hurt. Her hands were stiff. Her face felt swollen from crying. Still, she was there. The roof had not fallen. The stove had held. The baby moved under her palm. Elsie sat up, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and looked at the room that was now hers. It was not safe yet. It was not warm enough. It was not a home, but it had kept her through one winter night. And for the first time since the farmhouse door had closed behind her, Elsie had something no one else could lock against her. A place to begin. By the second morning, Elsie understood that surviving in the creamery would not be one brave act. It would be 100 small ones. She woke before sunrise with cold in her bones and ash on her sleeve. The stove had gone low again, leaving only a red eye under gray ash. Her first thought was not of Thomas, or Mrs. Harker, or the town whispering her name. Her first thought was wood. She rose carefully, one hand on the desk, and fed the fire before it could die. Then she ate the last of yesterday's bread, drank melted snow warmed in a tin cup she had scrubbed twice, and opened her mother's recipe box on the crate beside her. Not because she planned to cook, because she needed the handwriting. Do not throw away what can still feed someone. Elsie read it once, then closed the lid. All right, she whispered to the empty room. Then let's see what can still be used. She worked slowly because her body demanded it. The baby had been restless through the night, and every bend pulled at her back. Still, work gave her something to hold. She cleared the office first, stacking broken chair legs in one corner and sweeping dust toward the door with a bundle of stiff weeds tied together with twine. Then she moved into the milk room. In daylight, The room looked less frightening, but more ruined. The boarded windows leaked thin white lines across the floor. Rust had bloomed around the old pipes. The cracked sink was stained brown beneath the tap. A long wooden counter sagged at one end, and beneath it lay years of dirt, mouse nests, bottle caps, and curled scraps of paper. Elsie tied a cloth over her nose and began. She did not know what she was looking for. That was what made her look carefully. Her mother had always said that waste hid in corners. Flour at the bottom of a bin. Cream along the rim of a jar. Pennies inside coat linings. Useful things rarely stood in the center of a room, asking to be found. By noon, Elsie had filled 2 broken milk cans with trash. She found 3 glass bottles without cracks, a metal ladle, a coil of wire, and a heavy brush with half its bristles still stiff. She washed each thing in melted snow and placed them on the counter like evidence that the building had not given up everything. Then she noticed the drain. It sat near the middle of the milkroom floor, round and black, half hidden beneath dirt. At first, she thought it was only a floor drain, the kind every dairy room needed, but when she scraped around its edge with the ladle handle, she saw something strange. The drain did not slope toward the outside wall. It sat in a shallow depression that seemed to lead nowhere. Elsie frowned. She had washed enough floors at Harker Dairy to know how water behaved. It found the lowest path. It ran toward the outlet. It left marks where it traveled again and again. But the floor around this drain looked wrong. The old grooves did not run outward. They curved, as if water had once been guided down, not away. She pushed herself to her feet and studied the floor more closely. Most of the boards near the office were plain, pine, gray with age. But the section around the drain was different. Wider, harder, set tighter together. The seams had been packed with something dark that was not ordinary dirt. Elsie knelt again and pressed her palm against the boards. Cold rose through them. Not the ordinary cold of an unheated room, a deeper cold. Stone cold. She pulled her hand back. For several minutes, she only stared. Then wind struck the side of the creamery, making the boards over the windows tremble. The sound broke the spell. Elsie laughed once under her breath, embarrassed by her own imagination. It's a creamery, she told herself. Of course the floor is cold. Still, she did not move away. Near the wall behind the old counter, something else caught her eye. A mark in the lower stonework, almost hidden beneath grime. She wiped it with the edge of her sleeve. 3 letters appeared. M. H. Beneath them was a date. Itenjobai. The carving was small, made by a steady hand with a nail or knife point. Not a child's scratch, not vandalism. Someone had wanted it there, but had not wanted it seen easily. Elsie traced the letters without touching them. M.H. She did not know anyone with those initials. Harker did not fit. Grant did not fit. She searched the wall around it and found nothing else. No message, no arrow, no explanation. Only those letters and that year, low beside a floor that seemed colder than it should. By late afternoon, the light began to thin. Elsie knew she needed more wood before dark. She wrapped her coat tight and went outside to gather fallen branches from the frozen weeds near the milk platform. From there, she saw the back of the building clearly for the first time. A small mound of snow had drifted against the foundation. Above it, half covered by ice, was a narrow iron vent set into the stone, too low for a window, too deliberate to be a crack. Elsie stood still, branches in her arms. The vent had been painted over long ago. Someone had nailed a board across it, then another board over that. The wood was old, but the nails were newer than the creamery walls. Why board a vent no one could see from the road? The wind moved across the field. Elsie looked from the vent to the milkroom wall, then back again. Inside, beneath the floor, the cold seemed to wait. She carried the branches to the office and rebuilt the fire. But her mind stayed with the drain, the carved initials, and the sealed vent outside. That night, she did not sleep easily. The creamery made its old noises around her. Wood settling, wind pressing, mice moving behind walls. But beneath those sounds, Elsie imagined a silence lower than the floorboards. A silence with shape. Near midnight, She lit a candle and stepped into the milk room. The flame trembled in her hand. Its light fell across the drain and the tight boards around it. For the first time since buying the place, Elsie felt something other than fear. She felt watched over. Not by a ghost, not by anything foolish like that, by work left unfinished, by a room that had been closed before it was empty. Elsie stood there until the candle wax warmed her fingers. She did not yet know what waited beneath the floor. She did not know who M.H. had been. And she did not know that by touching those cold boards, she had placed her hand on the first piece of a story the Harkers had counted on staying buried. Morning came pale and hard, with frost feathered across the inside of the office window. Elsie did not go to the milk room at once. She built the fire first. She warmed snow in the tin cup. She ate the last corner of yesterday's bread with careful bites and told herself she was being sensible, not afraid. A cold floor, a carved set of initials, and a boarded vent did not mean treasure. They did not mean rescue. They might only mean rot, bad plumbing, and another repair she could not afford. Still, after she washed the cup and folded the blanket, she took the stub of pencil from the desk drawer and opened the back of one of her mother's recipe cards. M.H. Iten Jobai Sisherba. Floor drain curves inward. Vent outside boarded shut. Boards colder than the rest. She looked at the notes for a long time. A woman who keeps records is harder to erase. Elsie put the card in her coat pocket and went to work. The first task was the vent. Outside, the snow had drifted higher against the foundation. She cleared it with a broken board, stopping often to breathe through the ache in her back. The two planks across the vent were gray and warped, but the nails were stubborn. She found the old metal ladle, wedged its handle beneath the first plank, and pulled until the wood split. The sound cracked across the empty yard. Elsie froze, half expecting someone to shout. Only the wind answered. The second plank came loose more slowly. When it finally dropped into the snow, a breath of air slipped from the dark opening. Cold, deep, not dead air. Elsie crouched carefully and held her hand near the vent. There was space behind it. She carried the planks inside and set them by the stove, then lit a candle and returned to the milk room. The drain waited in the middle of the floor, black and still. The tight boards around it seemed darker in daylight, as if they had absorbed years of secrets through their seams. Elsie moved the broken counter away inch by inch. Under it, she found an iron ring set into one of the wider boards. Her heart began to beat faster. At first, the ring would not move. Dirt and old sealant had hardened around it. She scraped with a nail until her fingers cramped. Then, she wrapped the ring in a strip torn from her apron and pulled. Nothing. She sat back, breathing hard, anger rising hotter than the stove. "Not today," she whispered. She found a length of rusted pipe near the sink, slid it through the ring, and used both hands. The baby pressed low inside her. Pain tightened across her side. She stopped, counted to 10, then tried again. This time, the board groaned. A seam opened. Cold air rose through it. Elsie pulled once more, and the hatch lifted just enough for candlelight to fall into darkness below. For a moment, she could not move. There was not dirt beneath the floor. There were steps. Stone steps, narrow and steep, descending under the creamery. Elsie sat back on her heels, one hand over her mouth. The room seemed to tilt around her. All those years people had passed this building on the road. All those years they had called it dead, useless, empty. But it had not been empty. It had been closed. She waited until her breathing steadied. Then she went to the office, took the second candle, the matches, and the tin recipe box without knowing why. At the hatch, she hesitated only once before lowering herself onto the first step. The cold changed as she descended. Above, winter air was sharp and restless. Below, the cold was steady, held. Her footsteps sounded careful and small. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low chamber. Elsie lifted the candle. Stone shelves lined both walls. Not rough shelves. Built shelves, cut into the earth and braced with old timber. Wooden cheese forms sat in rows, some cracked, some still whole. A long table stood in the center, gray with dust but solid. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams. Against the far wall were round impressions where wheels had once rested and aged in the cool darkness. A cheese cave. Elsie knew the words before she fully understood them. She had heard men at Harker Farm talk about such places as if they belonged to old stories in European villages, not to a forgotten building outside town. But the proof stood around her in stone, wood, salt, and silence. This was not a basement for junk. This was a working room, a hidden one. On the central table sat a wooden box with a cracked leather strap. Beside it lay a stack of cloth, stiff with age, and 3 round molds wrapped in paper. The top of the box was marked with the same initials carved upstairs, M.H. Elsie set the candle down and opened it. Inside was a book. The cover had once been green, though time had browned the edges. When Elsie lifted it, the pages released a smell of paper, cellar cold, and faint salt. The handwriting inside was careful, narrow, and firm. Margaret Havel, Calumet Creamery, private make book. Etienne Jobai Sisherba. Elsie read the name once, then again, Margaret Havel. Not Harker. Page after page held recipes, temperatures, timings, weights, notes on milk, rennet, salt, washing, pressing, turning, waxing, aging. There were drawings of molds, lists of local farms, comments written in the margins. North pasture milk too sweet in May. Do not rush the curd. Cold cave holds steady at 48 degrees. A good wheel remembers patient hands. Elsie touched the edge of the page as gently as if it were skin. Her mother's recipe cards had taught her how a woman could leave herself behind in measurements. Here was another woman doing the same thing, but with milk, stone, and time. The cave had not only hidden a trade, it had hidden a voice. Beneath the recipe book was a ledger. Elsie opened it and found names. Dozens of them. Families from farms she knew. Stores from towns beyond the county. Orders written in neat columns. Cheddar wheels. Washed rind rounds. Butter. Cream. Payment received. Payment owed. Returned customers. The dates ran for years. This had been no failed little room. Calumet Creamery had sold widely. It had fed people. It had carried a name of its own. Then, near the back of the ledger, the handwriting changed. The entries grew uneven. Several customers were marked canceled. A note had been pressed between 2 pages, folded so many times the crease had nearly torn through. Elsie opened it. If they cut off the milk again, we cannot fill the orders. Harker has bought the route master. 3 farms came today, saying they were warned not to sell to us. They want this place starved, not beaten. Starved leaves fewer questions. Elsie read the words slowly. Harker. The candle flame shook in her hand. She turned the page. More notes appeared in the margin. Delivery wagon blocked twice. Bank called note early. Thomas Harker's grandfather offered half value for the building. Refused. 2 pages later, in darker ink, if anything happens to the make-book, remember, the cave is the creamery. Without it, they only own milk. With it, we own time. Elsie had to sit down on the stone step. Above her, the world seemed very far away. Mrs. Harker's pearl pin, Mr. Harker's envelope. Thomas saying bad luck, bad business, times changed. Bad luck had not closed this place. Bad business had not buried its name. Someone had wanted Calumet Creamery gone, not because it was worthless, because it was worth too much in the hands of people the Harkers could not control. Elsie sat in the cold cave with the ledger open on her knees and felt the shape of the discovery settle around her. The value was not gold. It was better and heavier than gold. It was a room that could hold steady cold, without ice. It was recipes tested by a woman whose work had been stolen from memory. It was a list of customers who had once trusted this name. It was a record of pressure, sabotage, and refusal. And it was a path, not an easy one, not a miracle. A path made of milk, salt, time, cleanliness, patience, and a woman's name written carefully where no one had managed to scrape it away. Elsie closed the ledger and held it against her chest. For the first time since she had stepped out of the Harker farmhouse, she did not feel only abandoned. She felt entrusted. When she climbed back into the milk room, the daylight seemed different. The broken pipes were still broken. The roof still leaked. The front room still smelled of mice and dust, but under her feet was a cave that had waited through years of silence. Elsie carried the book, the ledger, and one wooden mold into the office. She set them beside her mother's recipe box on the crate. Anna Grant's blue flower, Margaret Havel's green book, two women who had written things down so they would not disappear. Elsie stood over them with her hand resting on her belly. Then she said the first clear promise she had made since the door closed behind her. "I won't sell you." Elsie kept the cave secret for 3 days, not because she was ashamed of it, because she understood, with a clarity that settled in her bones, that anything valuable became dangerous the moment the wrong people knew it existed. She worked as quietly as the winter allowed. In the mornings, she cleared more snow from the back foundation and checked the old vent for airflow. At noon, she carried dust and broken boards out of the milk room. In the evenings, by the little iron stove, she copied Margaret Havel's recipes into a notebook using her own careful hand. She did not understand everything yet. Rennet, wash water, curd cut, pressing weight, aging time. The words were familiar enough to frighten her. She had heard them in pieces at Harker Farm, mostly from men who spoke as if women only scrubbed the tables afterward. But Margaret's book was not written like a man showing off. It was written like work, patient work. Do not heat too fast. Turn every wheel by hand. If the milk is honest, the cave will do the rest. That last line stayed with Elsie. Honest milk. She wondered where she was supposed to find that now. The old customer ledger told her who had once bought from Calumet Creamery, but not who would sell to a pregnant woman living in a broken building with $4 left and a family like the Harkers standing over the county. Every farm road around town seemed to lead back to their name somehow. Harker Bottles, Harker Routes, Harker Feed Credit, Harker Favors. By the fourth morning, she found out how quickly news traveled. She was outside prying loose a sheet of warped tin from the milk platform when a black motorcar turned off County Road M and rolled slowly down the lane. Elsie straightened. She knew the car before she saw the faces. Mr. Harker stepped out first, buttoning his coat against the wind. Mrs. Harker followed, lifting her skirt above the snow, as if the ground itself had offended her. Thomas came last. He looked thinner. Elsie hated herself for noticing. Mr. Harker looked at the building, then at the pile of broken boards near the door. "You've been busy," he said. Elsie kept the pry bar in her hand. "It needed work. It needs a match," Mrs. Harker said. Thomas glanced at the boarded windows. "Elsie, this place isn't safe." "Neither was yours." His face tightened. Mr. Harker's eyes moved past her toward the open door. Elsie stepped slightly to the side, blocking his view without making it obvious. "We came to discuss a practical solution," he said. Elsie almost smiled at the word practical. It seemed to be the family's favorite cover for cruelty. "What solution?" "We'll buy the property from you." "No." He blinked. "You haven't heard the offer." "I heard enough." Mrs. Harker's mouth hardened. "Do not be foolish. You paid $11 for a condemned structure. My husband is prepared to give you $50. A week earlier, that amount might have looked like rescue. A room for a while. Food. A doctor. Time." Elsie thought of the cave under her feet, the stone shelves, the green book, the note that said they want this place starved, not beaten. "No," she said again. Mr. Harker studied her more carefully then. "Has someone been talking to you?" Elsie felt the first touch of fear. "About what?" His gaze did not move. "About this property. No one talks to me much these days." "You made sure of that." Thomas took one step forward. "Elsie, Father is trying to help." She looked at him. "Is that what you call it when he offers $50 for something he told everyone was worthless?" Thomas had no answer. Mr. Harker's voice lowered. "A woman in your condition should not be living alone in a building like this. A woman in my condition should not have been put out in the snow." The wind moved between them. Mrs. Harker looked at Elsie's belly, then at the creamery door. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Elsie said. "You are." Mr. Harker's politeness thinned. "The county may still inspect the structure. If it is deemed unsafe, you can be removed. Then, send the inspector. I know him." "I assumed you did." For a second, something sharp flashed in his eyes. Elsie tightened her grip on the pry bar, not to threaten him, but to remind herself she was holding something solid. Mrs. Harker stepped close enough that Elsie could smell lavender soap under her wool collar. "You think this place makes you important," she said quietly. "It does not. It makes you stubborn. There is a difference." Elsie looked at the woman who had once handed her aprons, lists, dirty pans, and cold glances. She thought of Margaret Havel, carving her initials low on the stone wall, where no one could easily see. "I'm beginning to learn the difference myself," Elsie said. The Harkers left without another offer, but they did not leave her in peace. The next day, Mr. Alden at the grocery refused her credit for flour. "Nothing personal," he said, though he would not meet her eyes. "Hard times." At the feed store, the clerk told her there were no spare sacks, no cracked grain, no old brushes to sell cheap. Elsie could see all three behind him. At Mrs. Bell's laundry, a woman Elsie barely knew asked loudly whether it was true she had stolen papers from Harker Farm before leaving. Elsie stood very still with a bundle of washing in her arms. "No," she said. The woman sniffed. "People are saying. People say what powerful men pay them to say." The room went quiet. By evening, the first stone struck the creamery wall. Elsie was in the office copying one of Margaret's recipes when the sound cracked through the room. She froze. Another hit the boarded window. Then a boy's voice shouted from outside, "Creamery Queen!" Laughter followed, young and cruel. Elsie blew out the candle before they could see movement. She stood in the dark with one hand on her belly and waited until their footsteps ran back toward the road. Only then did she relight the flame. Wax trembled down the side of the candle. Her hands trembled too. She hated that. Fear was one thing. Having to admit it alone in a ruined building was another. That night, she carried Margaret's book, the ledger, and her mother's recipe box down into the cave. She wrapped them in cloth and placed them inside the wooden box marked MH. Then she pushed it behind a row of empty forms where it could not be seen from the stairs. If Mr. Harker sent an inspector, a clerk, or a thief, they might find broken pipes and dirty floors. They would not find the heart of the place. The next morning, a notice was nailed to the front door. "Unsafe structure, review pending." Elsie read it twice, then pulled it down and folded it carefully. Not because she accepted it, because paper mattered, threats mattered, dates mattered, names mattered. She placed the notice in her notebook beside her copy of Margaret's first recipe. Then she sat by the stove and looked at the 2 pages together. One page was meant to frighten her out. The other was meant to teach her how to stay. Elsie laid her hand over the recipe. "All right," she whispered. If the Harkers wanted to starve the creamery again, they would first have to learn that she had been hungry before. And hunger had taught her how to count every crumb. Elsie found Greta Havel through a single name in Margaret's ledger. Havel Farm Morning Milk, clean, high butterfat. The line appeared again and again, always beside careful notes. Sweet spring grass, honest cans. Trust Havel milk when others water theirs. Elsie copied the name onto a scrap of paper and asked Mrs. Bell whether anyone named Havel still lived nearby. The laundry woman paused over a shirt collar. Greta Havel, North Ridge. Margaret was her aunt. People remember Margaret? Mrs. Bell looked toward the window before answering. Some remember. Most learned not to say her name where Harkers can hear it. That was enough. The next morning, Elsie walked to the ridge with Margaret's copied page folded inside her coat. Greta's house was small, square, and guarded by dark pines. Empty milk cans sat upside down along the porch. When Elsie knocked, a thin, white-haired woman opened the door only as wide as the chain allowed. "I'm not buying anything," Greta said. "I'm not selling." Greta's eyes moved to Elsie's belly. "Then what are you doing out here?" Elsie held up the copied page. "I found Margaret Havel's makebook." The chain came off slowly. Inside, Greta's kitchen smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and boiled potatoes. Elsie placed the copied page on the table. Greta stared at the handwriting without touching it. For a long moment, the old woman's face did not move. Then her mouth trembled. "They said she failed," Greta whispered. "Did she?" Greta lifted her eyes. "No." She told the story in short pieces. Margaret had bought milk from small farms. The Harkers underpaid. She made cheese slowly, aged it properly, and sold it under the Calumet name. Then farmers were warned not to sell to her. Delivery routes disappeared. The bank called a note early. A health inspector came the same week a Harker cousin took a county job. They did not beat her, Greta said. They starved the road around her. Elsie listened without interrupting. What happened to the cave? She asked. Greta looked at her sharply. So Elsie knew the cave had mattered. My aunt locked it before she left, Greta said. She told me the cold would hold if the right hands ever came. Are mine the right hands? Greta studied her. I don't know, Elsie nodded. Neither do I. That truth was what made Greta stand. The next day, she came to the creamery with a canvas bag, a wool shawl, and a temper sharper than winter. She walked once through the milkroom, sniffed, and said, "Filthy, not hopeless." Greta did not rescue Elsie. Her knees were bad, and her hands shook when she was tired. But she taught what mattered. She showed Elsie how to scrub stone with salt water, how to clean a wooden mold without splitting it, how to warm milk slowly, and how to watch the curd instead of bullying it. Cheese is not made by force, Greta said. It is persuaded. Elsie wrote that down. They still needed milk. 3 farmers refused. Some feared Harker routes. Some owed feed money. Some simply did not want trouble. The 4th was Amos Reed, a widower with 6 cows and a barn door hanging crooked. Harkers won't like it, he said. Greta snorted. That is not a law. Amos looked at Elsie. Can you pay? Not much today, she said. But I will write down every gallon. I will pay fair when the first wheels sell. And I will not erase your name from the record. That reached him. He gave her 10 gallons. Not enough for a business. Enough for a beginning. At dusk, Elsie, Greta, and Amos carried the milk into the creamery. From the road, the building still looked broken. Inside, it smelled different, not restored. Awake, Elsie opened Margaret's book beside her mother's tin recipe box. Greta placed one shaking finger on the first line of the recipe. Elsie picked up her pencil. This time, she was not only surviving, she was learning how to build. The first wheel of cheese did not look like victory. It looked small, pale, and uncertain beneath the cloth. Elsie stood over it with sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands raw from salt water, hair pinned badly at the back of her neck. Greta leaned on a chair beside the table, pretending not to watch too closely. Amos Reed stood near the door with his cap in both hands. No one spoke when Elsie lifted the cloth. The wheel held its shape. That was all. Not perfect, not ready for a prize, not enough to feed a town. But it held. Greta nodded once. Again. So Elsie did it again. For the next 2 weeks, the creamery became a place of labor instead of hiding. Milk arrived before dawn from Amos, then from one more farmer, then another who came after dark and asked that his name not be said aloud yet. Elsie wrote every gallon down. She paid what she could. She promised the rest clearly, with dates. The cave did its work slowly. Wheels rested on the stone shelves. Elsie turned them by hand. She checked them by candlelight. She cleaned, salted, warmed, cooled, lifted, failed, and tried again. Some cracked, one soured. Another collapsed under its own weight. Greta made her keep notes on the failures too. Especially those, she said. Pride forgets, paper remembers. If you're still watching, you understand why this mattered. Subscribe for more stories about people the world underestimated. Because Elsie's fight was no longer only about shelter. It was about putting her name on something honest. The confrontation came at the Saturday market in town. Elsie had not planned to sell much. She brought only 3 small wheels, wrapped in clean cloth, with a hand-lettered card propped beside them. Calumet Creamery, restored by Elsie Grant. Milk from local farms. Mrs. Bell gave her a corner of her laundry table. Greta sat behind her like a small white-haired guard dog. Amos stood nearby, pretending to examine turnips. At first, people only looked. Then one woman tasted a shaving from the knife Elsie had cleaned twice that morning. She stopped chewing, looked at the wrapped wheel, and said, "My grandmother used to buy something like this." Greta's chin lifted. Another customer came. Then another. By noon, half the first wheel was gone. That was when the Harkers arrived. Mr. Harker walked through the market as if the floorboards belonged to him. Mrs. Harker came beside him, gloved hands folded. Thomas followed a step behind. The market quieted before they reached the table. Mr. Harker looked at the sign. Calumet Creamery, he said. That name has no standing. Elsie placed both hands on the table so no one would see them shake. The deed says the building is mine. The building, perhaps. Not the reputation attached to it. Mrs. Harker looked at the cheese with open disgust. You are selling food from an unsafe structure. A few customers stepped back. Elsie reached under the table and brought out a folder. The inspection was completed yesterday. Mr. Harker's eyes narrowed. Greta smiled without warmth. Elsie opened the paper. The county listed 3 repairs required before full operation. None prevented limited production using inspected milk, cleaned equipment, and approved storage. The health clerk near the apple stand shifted uncomfortably. He had signed the notice himself after Greta demanded to watch the inspection from start to finish. Mr. Harker's voice hardened. You expect people to trust your handling? No, Elsie said. I expect them to trust the record. She placed Amos's milk entries beside the inspection paper. Dates, gallons, temperatures, cleaning notes, cave readings. Every page written in her hand, Mrs. Harker's gaze flicked across the papers. A woman can write anything. Elsie looked at her. Yes. That is why dates, signatures, and witnesses matter. Greta stood slowly. My aunt wrote things down too, she said. Mr. Harker turned toward her. For the first time, he looked less certain. Greta placed Margaret's copied ledger page on the table. Your family told this county Margaret Hovel failed because she was careless. Here are her customers. Here are the farms warned not to sell to her. Here are the notes she made when Harker men blocked her deliveries. The market had gone silent. Thomas stared at the page as if seeing an old door open under his feet. Mr. Harker said, Old accusations are not proof. No, Elsie said. She opened Margaret's ledger to the folded note near the back. The original paper trembled slightly in the wind. But patterns are. She set down the unsafe structure notice, the grocery refusal signed by Mr. Alden, the feed store note denying supplies, and her own list of farmers afraid to sell milk because of Harker routes. You tried to starve this place once, Elsie said. You tried again with me. Mr. Harker's face darkened. Be careful. I have been careful, she said. That is why I kept everything. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Bell stepped forward and bought a wedge. Amos bought another, though he had helped make it. The woman who remembered her grandmother bought the rest of the half-wheel. Small acts, one after another, until the silence broke. Thomas finally spoke. Father, he said softly, is it true? Mr. Harker turned on him. Get in the car. But Thomas did not move. Elsie looked at him only once. Then she turned back to the table. This goes out under my name, she said. By the end of the market, every piece of cheese was gone. And for the first time, people left carrying Calumet Creamery home in their hands. Victory did not come with applause. It came in smaller sounds. A knock on the creamery door before sunrise. A farmer clearing his throat and saying he had 2 cans of milk if Elsie was still buying. Mrs. Bell arriving with clean cloths folded in a basket. The health clerk returning with a proper form, his face red, his voice stiff, saying the remaining repairs could be completed within 30 days if production stayed limited. And Greta Hovel sitting at the old table with Margaret's ledger open in front of her, writing down the names of every farmer who came. Make the record clean, she told Elsie. Cleaner than theirs ever was. The town did not change all at once. Some still crossed the street when Elsie passed. Some still bought Harker milk because habit was easier than courage. Mr. Alden at the grocery did not apologize. But one morning he placed a sack of flour on the counter and said, Pay when you can. Elsie did not thank him too warmly. She simply wrote it down. The Harkers tried once more. A lawyer came from Appleton with a polished briefcase and a letter offering $200 for the creamery, the land beneath it, and any associated materials, records, equipment, or recipes found on the premises. Elsie read the letter twice. Then she placed it on the table between her mother's tin recipe box and Margaret Hovel's green makebook. $200. Enough to rent a room for months. Enough to buy baby clothes, coal, medicine, and rest. For a tired woman, money could sound almost like mercy. Greta watched her silently. Elsie looked toward the open hatch leading down to the cave. Below, the first wheels were aging on stone shelves in steady cold. Above, the roof still needed patching. Her back ached most mornings. Her hands were cracked. The child inside her had grown heavy enough that climbing stairs took her breath. She picked up the lawyer's pen. On the bottom of the offer, she wrote one word: no. Then she added her name beneath it. Elsie Grant. Not Harker. Not hidden. Not temporary. When the lawyer left, he looked offended, as if poverty had failed to behave properly. The next week, the first larger order came from a hotel in Fond du Lac. The owner's mother had remembered Calumet Creamery from childhood and sent a letter in careful blue ink. If it is truly the same place, send 6 wheels when ready. Elsie read that sentence aloud in the milk room. Amos took off his cap. Greta turned away, but not before Elsie saw her eyes shine. By spring, repairs began. Not grand repairs, honest ones. Amos fixed the milk platform. Mrs. Bell's nephew patched the office roof. 2 farm wives came with scrub brushes and did not ask to be praised. Someone left a cradle on the porch with a note pinned to the blanket. For the baby, no name. Elsie kept the note anyway. At the county office, the creamery license was recorded under her name. The clerk hesitated before sliding the paper across the desk, as if the ink itself might cause trouble. Elsie placed her palm on it. For months, men had spoken over her, around her, and about her. Now the county had written what she already knew. The creamery was hers. The work was hers. The name going forward would be hers, and she had not bought her dignity back with revenge. She had earned it, gallon by gallon, page by page, wheel by wheel. Summer came slowly to the creamery. It came first as meltwater running from the roof in thin silver lines, then as mud beside the lane, then as grass pushing through the hard places near the milk platform, green and stubborn, as if the earth itself had decided the building was not dead after all. Elsie's child was born on a rainy morning in May, while thunder rolled low over the fields. Greta stayed with her until the midwife arrived. Mrs. Bell boiled water in the little office where Elsie had once slept on the floor. Amos stood outside under the eaves, holding his hat in both hands and looking terrified of every sound that came through the wall. When the baby finally cried, the creamery seemed to change shape around the sound. Not larger, softer. Elsie named her Anna Margaret Grant. Anna for the mother who had taught her to write things down. Margaret for the woman who had kept a cave waiting in the cold. Weeks later, Elsie stood in the doorway with her daughter wrapped against her chest. The creamery was still rough in places. One window remained boarded. The back wall needed limewash. The office floor still sloped where the old boards had warped. But the stove worked. The milkroom was clean. The cave held steady. On the stone shelves below, new wheels rested beside the first successful batch, each one marked with a careful stamp. Grant Creamery, Calumet, Wisconsin. Greta had argued about the name. Calumet should stay, she said. It was Margaret's. It will, Elsie answered. But so will mine. Now both names stood together on every label. That was how Elsie wanted it. Not one woman erased to make room for another. Not one story buried under the next. A line of hands, reaching forward. One evening near the end of June, the first community supper was held outside the creamery. No one called it that officially. People simply came. Amos brought milk. Mrs. Bell brought bread. 2 farm wives brought pickles and pies. A boy who had once thrown stones at the window came with his mother and left a bundle of kindling by the door without looking Elsie in the eye. Elsie accepted it. Forgiveness, like cheese, could not be rushed. Thomas came near dusk. He stood at the edge of the lane, thinner than before, his hat in his hands. Elsie saw him from the milk platform, but did not go to him at once. For a moment, she only held her daughter closer and watched the wind move through the grass. When he finally approached, he looked at the baby, then at the creamery. "She is beautiful," he said. "Yes," Elsie answered. "I should have stood with you." "Yes," she said again. He took a folded paper from his coat. There are old route records in my father's office. More than what Margaret wrote. I copied what I could. Elsie looked at the paper, but did not reach for it yet. Why? Because it's true, Thomas said. And because she should know one decent thing about where half of her blood came from. Elsie took the paper. Thank you, she said. Nothing more. He did not ask to hold the child. Elsie was grateful for that. After he left, Greta came to stand beside her. You all right? Elsie looked down at Anna Margaret's sleeping face. I think so. That night, after the last neighbor walked home and the lanterns burned low, Elsie went inside alone. She placed her mother's tin recipe box on the shelf above the work table. Beside it, she set Margaret Havel's green book, now wrapped in clean cloth. Then she opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote the date, the weather, the milk received, the yield from the last batch, and one final line beneath it all. This place fed us because someone refused to let it be forgotten. Elsie closed the notebook and listened. Below the floor, the cave held its patient cold. Above it, her daughter breathed softly in a cradle near the stove. Outside, the old sign moved in the summer wind, no longer pointing toward the ditch. Amos had fixed it straight that morning. The faded letters were still visible beneath the new paint. For years, people had passed that road and seen only ruin. Now there was light in the windows, milk at the door, bread on the table, a child asleep where fear had once slept. Elsie stepped outside and stood beneath the sign with her daughter in her arms. Fireflies blinked over the grass. The fields beyond the lane were dark and wide, but they no longer looked empty. The world had called her disposable. It had called the Creamery worthless. But she had stayed long enough to listen, and in the cold beneath the floor, she had found not a miracle, not a fortune, but a way to stand. The Creamery had given her work. It had given her witnesses. It had given her a name. And as the summer wind moved softly across Wisconsin, Elsie Grant carried her sleeping daughter inside and closed the door of her own home.